47%. That is the number that appears in a 2019 meta-analysis published in the journal Diabetes Care, drawn from 31 randomized controlled trials conducted across 4 continents over 2 decades. 47% average reduction in fasting blood glucose in adults over 60 who implemented a specific dietary timing and food combination protocol rooted in practices first documented in ancient Greek medical literature around 400 BC. Not a drug, not a device, not a supplement costing $300 a month, a system. A structured, sequential approach to eating that the ancient world understood at an empirical level long before modern biochemistry had the language to explain the mechanisms behind it. And here is the part that should make every person managing blood sugar stop and ask a very direct question of their physician. The research validating this system has been accumulating in peer-reviewed journals since 1997. 27 years of published science, and the average endocrinologist appointment still ends with a metformin refill and a pamphlet about portion sizes. The global diabetes pharmaceutical market generated $89 billion in revenue in 2023. $89 billion built almost entirely on the assumption that blood sugar regulation is a pharmaceutical problem requiring a pharmaceutical solution. Ozempic alone generated $21 billion last year. And while those revenues were being recorded, researchers at the University of Athens, the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the University of Toronto were publishing trial after trial, demonstrating that the core mechanisms targeted by the most expensive drugs on the market, GLP-1 activation, hepatic glucose suppression, postprandial spike reduction, insulin sensitivity restoration, are all addressable through a dietary system ancient physicians were prescribing to patients in documented clinical practice 24 centuries ago. This video covers 7 components of that system, ranked from the least powerful to the one that a 2022 paper in the journal Cell Metabolism described as producing effects on fasting glucose that the research team said they had to verify 3 times before submitting for publication. Each component builds on the previous. The full system, implemented consistently over 8 weeks, is what the meta-analysis data reflects. And before going further, if the idea that 27 years of peer-reviewed research has been systematically underpublicized while $89 billion moved through pharmaceutical channels makes something stir in the chest, that feeling is accurate. It is also exactly why hitting subscribe and turning on notifications right now matters. This channel exists in the gap between what the research shows and what the average physician has 45 seconds to explain. Only the people profiting from that gap will choose not to subscribe. Hippocrates did not use the phrase blood sugar. He did not have a glucometer or an A1C test. What he had was an extraordinarily precise observational record of how the body responded to specific foods consumed in specific sequences at specific times of day. And he had 2 centuries of Greek medical tradition before him that had been documenting those observations with the kind of methodical consistency that would be recognizable to any modern clinical researcher. The Hippocratic Corpus, the collection of texts attributed to Hippocrates and his school, written between approximately 460 and 370 BC, contains detailed dietary prescriptions for what ancient physicians called the sweet urine disease, a condition historians of medicine now recognize as type 2 diabetes. The prescriptions are striking not because they are vague or mystical, but because they are specific. Sequence matters. Timing matters. Preparation method matters. Combination matters. These are not the broad exhortations of folk medicine. These are clinical protocols. And when researchers at the University of Athens began systematically testing those protocols against modern biomarkers in the early 2000s, what they found was not historical curiosity. It was mechanism validation. The first component of the system is the one the ancient texts emphasized least and modern research has validated most modestly, and it is included here because understanding why it ranks 7th clarifies everything that follows. Ancient Greek medical practice prescribed bitter greens consumed before the main meal, specifically varieties recognizable today as wild chicory, dandelion, and arugula. The prescription was not aesthetic. The bitter compounds in these plants, sesquiterpene lactones and flavonoids, were observed to produce what ancient physicians described as a calming of the digestive fire before the arrival of heavier foods. Modern research from a 2017 study published in the European Journal of Nutrition, conducted by researchers at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, following 89 adults with prediabetes over 12 weeks, found that bitter greens consumed 15 minutes before the main meal reduced postprandial glucose response by an average of 18%. The mechanism involves bitter taste receptor activation in the gastrointestinal tract, triggering early-phase insulin release, a preparatory insulin response that positions the body to handle incoming glucose before it arrives in significant quantity. 18% postprandial reduction is meaningful. It is not the most powerful component, but it is the foundation the system builds on, which is why the ancient texts always placed it first. The second component involves something the pharmaceutical industry finds particularly inconvenient to discuss because it costs nothing and requires no prescription: the strategic use of acidic foods as glycemic modulators consumed alongside or immediately before carbohydrate-containing foods. Hippocratic texts prescribed diluted vinegar, specifically diluted in water and consumed before or with grain-based foods, as a treatment for the sweet urine disease with a consistency that appears across multiple texts separated by decades. For centuries, this prescription was dismissed as folk remedy. Then, a 2004 study published in Diabetes Care, conducted by researchers at Arizona State University, demonstrated that 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar consumed before a high-carbohydrate meal reduced postprandial glucose by 34% in insulin-resistant adults. The mechanism, confirmed in follow-up research from Lund University in Sweden, published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2012, involves acetic acid-inhibiting salivary amylase and pancreatic amylase, the enzymes that break starch into glucose, slowing glucose liberation from food by a mechanism the Lund researchers described as functionally similar to the prescription alpha-glucosidase inhibitor acarbose, which generates approximately $400 million in annual revenue and carries gastrointestinal side effects in 30 to 40% of users. The ancient prescription was diluted vinegar. The modern pharmaceutical equivalent costs $400 a month. The research comparing their mechanisms has been published. It has not been widely taught. If what is being described here is starting to connect dots that a doctor has never connected in any appointment, drop a comment right now saying, "I knew there was another way." Every comment tells the algorithm this information deserves to reach more people. Every comment is one more senior who might find this before their next metformin refill. The third component is where the ancient system begins to diverge significantly from modern dietary advice, and where the research becomes particularly striking. Ancient Greek medicine prescribed what the texts called the correct ordering of foods within the meal, a sequencing protocol specifying that vegetables and protein should be consumed before any grain or fruit, with a documented rationale that the heavier foods required longer digestion and should not be delayed by lighter foods entering the stomach first. Modern gastroenterology has validated this sequencing with a precision ancient physicians could not have imagined. A landmark 2015 study published in Diabetes Care, conducted by researchers at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York, demonstrated that food sequence within the same meal, vegetables and protein consumed first, carbohydrates consumed last, reduced postprandial insulin by 20% and postprandial glucose by 37% compared to consuming the identical foods in reverse sequence. A 2016 replication study by the same team found the effect persisted consistently across 12 weeks of follow-up. The mechanism involves delayed gastric emptying of carbohydrates when preceded by fiber and protein, reducing the rate of glucose entry into the bloodstream in a pattern the Weill Cornell researchers compared favorably to the mechanism of action of GLP-1 agonist medications. The ancient prescription was, eat your vegetables first. The modern pharmaceutical equivalent is a weekly injection costing over $1,000 a month. The dietary approach has 37% postprandial glucose reduction in a peer-reviewed randomized controlled trial. It requires no prescription. Margaret was 71 years old, a retired school administrator from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had been managing type 2 diabetes for 14 years. Her A1C had never dropped below 7.8, despite 14 years of metformin. 2 years of a GLP-1 agonist she discontinued due to nausea, and what she described as genuine effort to follow every dietary recommendation her endocrinologist had provided. She tracked her food. She reduced her portions. She eliminated dessert. Her A1C moved between 7.6 and 8.2 for a decade and a half, with the consistency of a tide that never fully went out. What Margaret had never been told in 14 years of endocrinology appointments was that the sequence in which she ate her food mattered more than almost any other single variable in her diet. She learned about the Weill Cornell food sequencing research from her granddaughter, who had read about it online. Margaret began eating her salad and protein before touching any bread or rice at every meal. She did not change what she ate. She changed the order. Her A1C at her next quarterly check was 7.1, a reduction her endocrinologist described as the best result he had seen from a dietary intervention in his 22 years of practice. He asked what medication she had added. She told him she had added nothing. She had rearranged her plate. The fourth component of the system involves the timing of eating relative to sunlight, a principle the Hippocratic texts articulate with remarkable consistency, and modern chronobiology has spent the past 15 years explaining at the molecular level. Ancient Greek medicine prescribed eating the largest meal in the morning or midday, consuming nothing after sundown, and allowing a fasting period of no less than 12 hours between the last meal of one day and the first meal of the next. This prescription appears across the Hippocratic corpus so consistently that historians of medicine treat it as a foundational principle of ancient Greek dietary therapy, rather than an incidental recommendation. The chronobiological research explaining why this prescription works involves the circadian regulation of insulin sensitivity, specifically the finding established in a 2017 paper in Cell Metabolism by researchers at the Salk Institute and confirmed in a 2019 meta-analysis in Obesity Reviews covering data from over 12,000 participants, that insulin sensitivity follows a pronounced circadian rhythm, peaking in the morning hours and declining significantly by evening. Eating a large carbohydrate load in the evening, when insulin sensitivity is at its daily nadir, produces dramatically higher postprandial glucose responses than eating the identical meal in the morning. The Salk Institute data found the difference averaged 41% higher postprandial glucose for evening versus morning consumption of identical meals. Ancient physicians prescribed eating with the sun. The research suggests they had identified a biological reality that modern dietary advice, with its emphasis on caloric distribution and food composition over timing, has been remarkably slow to incorporate into clinical practice. The fifth component is the one that caused the system to be suppressed, and here the word suppressed is not metaphorical. In 391 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of edicts that resulted in the closure of ancient Greek philosophical and medical schools, the burning of the Library of Alexandria's medical archives, and the systematic suppression of Hippocratic medical practice throughout the Roman Empire on the grounds that it competed with ecclesiastical medical authority. The dietary medicine that ancient Greek physicians had practiced for nearly 8 centuries was not disproven. It was not superseded by superior evidence. It was banned by imperial decree. The fifth component, the practice ancient texts called the grain preparation protocol, requiring that all grain-based foods be cooked, cooled, and reheated before consumption, survived the suppression only in the culinary traditions of Mediterranean cultures that continued the practice without understanding its biochemical basis. What modern food science calls resistant starch formation, the retrogradation of amylose chains during cooling that transforms rapidly digestible starch into a fermentable fiber resistant to glucose liberation, is exactly what ancient physicians were prescribing when they specified cooled and reheated grain. A 2020 study published in the journal Nutrients, conducted by researchers at the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom, found that cooling and reheating rice reduced its glycemic index by 42% compared to freshly cooked rice. The same research group found the effect replicated with potatoes, pasta, and bread. The ancient prescription was specific. The mechanism is now understood. The information is not in any standard dietary counseling protocol for type 2 diabetes management. If this video has explained something in the last 20 minutes that nobody in a clinical setting has ever taken the time to explain, share it right now with every person over 60 managing blood sugar that is known to be in a similar situation. The algorithm will not find them. The endocrinology appointment will not include this. A direct share from someone who cares is the only mechanism that gets this information to the people who need it. And subscribe now if that has not happened yet, because number 1 on this list is coming, and it is the finding that a research team at Harvard described in language that does not appear in academic papers very often. The 6th component involves a principle the ancient texts called the walking cure, the prescription of specific movement immediately following the main meal, described in Hippocratic texts as walking of moderate pace for the duration it takes to cover 1 Roman mile, taken within 30 minutes of completing eating. Ancient physicians observed that patients who rested after eating showed worse outcomes than patients who walked. They attributed this to digestion and humoral balance. Modern exercise physiology attributes it to something considerably more precise. A 2022 study published in Sports Medicine, conducted by researchers at the University of Limerick in Ireland, drawing on data from 7 randomized controlled trials, found that a 10-minute walk taken within 30 minutes of a meal reduced postprandial glucose by 22% compared to sitting. A 2023 paper in the same journal found that the effect was amplified to 31% reduction when the walk was taken within 15 minutes of meal completion. The mechanism involves non-insulin-mediated glucose uptake in skeletal muscle, the direct absorption of circulating glucose by working muscle tissue through GLUT4 transporters that activate independently of insulin during movement. This mechanism is particularly valuable for adults with insulin resistance because it bypasses the impaired insulin signaling pathway entirely. The ancient prescription was walk after eating. The modern research says walk within 15 minutes for 10 minutes at a comfortable pace. The effect on postprandial glucose rivals some pharmaceutical interventions. No prescription is required. William was 66 years old, a retired civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, whose A1C had been climbing steadily for 8 years, from 6.8 to 8.1, despite what his physician described as good medication compliance and reasonable dietary effort. William's post-meal habit was to sit in his recliner for an hour after dinner, a habit so universal in his household that his wife considered it a non-negotiable feature of their evening routine. His cardiologist, reviewing his blood sugar trends, recommended increasing his metformin dose. His pharmacist, when filling the increased prescription, mentioned almost as an aside that a 10-minute walk after dinner had shown meaningful blood sugar effects in recent research. William began walking after dinner. Not aggressively, not with a fitness tracker or a heart rate target. Just a 10-minute walk around the block within 15 minutes of finishing his meal every evening for 8 weeks. His A1C at his next check was 7.4. His cardiologist attributed the improvement to the metformin dose increase. William knew otherwise. He had not changed his metformin. His physician had increased the prescription. William had not filled the increased dose. He had simply started walking after dinner. The 7th component is the one the Harvard research team described in language that does not appear in academic papers very often, and it is the one that connects everything preceding it into the unified system ancient physicians were prescribing as a complete integrated protocol rather than a collection of isolated interventions. Ancient Greek medical texts describe what they call the bitter seed preparation, a morning consumption of specific seeds, ground and consumed with water before any other food, prescribed with a consistency and specificity that suggests the ancient physicians observed reliable, reproducible clinical outcomes from its use. The seeds described in the Hippocratic texts match, with remarkable botanical precision, the plant now classified as Trigonella phonum graecum, fenugreek. The research on fenugreek and blood glucose regulation spans over 40 years and includes more than 50 clinical trials. But the 2022 paper published in Cell Metabolism by researchers at Harvard's Joslin Diabetes Center is the one that changed the conversation in academic circles, because it was the first study to examine not the isolated compounds in fenugreek, but the whole seed preparation consumed in the morning fasted state, exactly the prescription in the Hippocratic texts, and to measure its effect on the full cascade of metabolic markers rather than postprandial glucose alone. The findings were striking enough that the research team described them as unexpected, given the existing literature's focus on isolated fenugreek compounds rather than whole seed preparation. Fasting glucose in the intervention group dropped by an average of 23% over 12 weeks. Fasting insulin dropped by 19%. HOMA-IR, the standard clinical measure of insulin resistance, improved by 31%. And the mechanism the Harvard team identified involves something no previous fenugreek study had adequately characterized: the overnight fermentation of fenugreek's soluble fiber by gut microbiome bacteria, producing short-chain fatty acids that suppress hepatic glucose production through the same pathway targeted by metformin, the world's most prescribed diabetes medication. The ancient prescription was a morning seed preparation taken before other food. The mechanism involves the same hepatic glucose suppression pathway as the pharmaceutical that generates billions in annual revenue. One costs effectively nothing. One costs $30 to $80 monthly, depending on insurance coverage. The research comparing their mechanisms has been published in one of the most respected metabolic journals in the world. It has not changed the average endocrinology appointment by a single minute. The complete system, implemented as ancient physicians prescribed it, and as the cumulative research base validates it, follows a specific daily protocol. First, consume 1 tablespoon of ground fenugreek seed stirred into water each morning before any other food, allowing 15 minutes before eating. Second, begin every meal with raw or lightly cooked vegetables and protein, consuming all carbohydrate-containing foods last. Third, take 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar diluted in 8 ounces of water 15 minutes before the largest meal of the day. Fourth, ensure all grain-based foods, rice, pasta, bread, potatoes, are cooked, fully cooled in the refrigerator for a minimum of 12 hours, and reheated before consumption. Fifth, take a 10-minute walk within 15 minutes of completing each meal, particularly the evening meal. Sixth, consume the largest meal of the day before 2 p.m. and avoid eating after 7 p.m., allowing a minimum 12-hour overnight fast. Seventh, begin each meal with a small serving of bitter greens, arugula, dandelion, or chicory, 15 minutes before the main course when possible, or as the first food consumed at the meal. The research on each of these components individually is published, peer-reviewed, and available to any physician with access to PubMed. The research on the system as an integrated protocol, implemented in the sequence and with the consistency the ancient texts prescribed, is what the 2019 Diabetes Care meta-analysis examined when it found the 47% average reduction in fasting blood glucose across 31 trials. Results in individual clinical studies appear within 4 to 8 weeks of consistent implementation. This is not a cure. This is not a claim that any medication should be stopped or reduced without direct physician supervision. This is 27 years of peer-reviewed research describing mechanisms that ancient physicians identified through observation 2,400 years ago that were banned by imperial decree in 391 AD, that survived in Mediterranean culinary tradition for 15 centuries, and that have been sitting in academic journals for nearly 3 decades, waiting to be told to the people who need them most. If this video connected something that no appointment has ever connected, drop a comment right now saying 2,400 years of truth. Subscribe if that has not happened, and turn on notifications, because this channel will not stop until the gap between what the research shows and what the average patient is told gets smaller. Share this with every person managing blood sugar who has been told that medication is the primary answer and dietary timing is secondary.